Hello. So my name's George English, Director of Research Through People. Me and Dick Stone, we had a very interesting conversation last time, which we're going to carry on today. Dick, good to see you again.
George, it's a pleasure to be back. I always enjoy our talks, our conversations. Across the pond, just to remind people that I'm sitting here on the east coast of the United States and you're somewhere in the middle of England on the other side.
There's expressions that people have, the pond, I mean, it's is that tongue-in-cheek humor or something? But we all know what you're talking about, don't we?
Well, we can't call it a Great Lake because we have some Great Lakes ourselves and they're freshwater.
Absolutely. So last time we talked about the ships and the things associated with that. This time what we're going to do is talk much more about the people, the so-called saints and strangers who went on the Mayflower in 1620. And of course, there were people on the Mayflower II in the 1950s we'll come back to. It's such a human story. But what I really find about this is just that it's people like you and I living their life in a village or something, and events happen that eventually lead to these people going on board. And of course, Richard, in your book, your project Mayflower, about the Mayflower II, again, you had people who made it happen, people who went on the journey.
Yes, they did indeed. And several of the people on this ship were descendants, not many, but there were a few. And
Right.
the rest of them merely say that they came across on the Mayflower. It's just the second one.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll talk about that as well, won't we? So if I share screen, let me just get that up. And let's look at the way Europe was, or look at the way Europe is now. Again, one of the things that I find so interesting here is the different perspectives in America and in Europe. I said last time, this was one ship with 100 people that left Europe, that left Britain. And we got on with life. To America, it's such a different perspective. But what's intriguing now is, of course, so special to Americans, and people are descended from, I reckon there are 35 million descendants of the people who were on the Mayflower. But of course, their ancestors, the people on the Mayflower, came from, almost all of them, from England 400 years ago. So, of course, we living in England know a lot about England, particularly the way it is now. But America's got far more to learn. Equally, the perspective from a European point of view, America's different. I said last time about how it's a much newer country relatively, and so on. So the people, it's so interesting to look at that. But if you come across to Europe, if you're American and don't know Europe very well, here is the way Europe is now. We have what's called the United Kingdom. And of course, that comprises of England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. There are various countries, you'll know, France, Germany, and Spain. Now, some of them are there in 1600, some of them weren't. The countries of Holland and Belgium weren't countries then, they were provinces. France had a slightly different border. So let's go back. If you keep that in your mind, keep in mind particularly, there's England and there's the English Channel between England and the rest of Europe. And that's been a very big factor in history, the fact it's harder to get across that and so on. And we talk about events that happened. And we mentioned last time Martin Luther. He was in a part of Germany. There was no Germany then as a country. We mentioned, well, we're going to talk about other people. We'll come back to it. So with that in mind, that's the way Europe is now. Let's go back 400 or more years to Europe in the 16th century. So here we are, we have the countries of England and Scotland, but there's no United Kingdom. They haven't joined together. There's France. It was a country then. The border was slightly different. I mentioned the Netherlands. Netherlands being Low Countries. There were 17 provinces, and they were actually ruled by Spain. They were known as the Spanish Netherlands. The Germany was the German Empire. Now, the most powerful country then for religion was Italy. Virtually the whole of Europe wasn't just Catholic, it was Roman Catholic, controlled by the Pope down in Rome. The most powerful country was Spain. Spain, as I mentioned, ruled the Spanish Netherlands. During the century, they went to South America and brought back wealth from there and so on. And so they were then the most powerful country in Europe. Now, I mentioned last time, two big events happened more than 100 years before 1620 that influenced the Mayflower leaving. The first was Christopher Columbus discovering the New World in 1492. And it was interesting that Dick talked about the Mayflower II actually took the route that Columbus's ships took. And I said this, when he went, he didn't know where he was going. He actually was Italian, interesting enough, but he was funded by the Spanish government. When he got there, he didn't know where he was. When he came back, he didn't know where he'd been. So they used this term, the New World. And that was, if you like, the pool. From 1492 on, various people explored there, tried to make discoveries, colonize the place, and so on. Now, the other big event that happened was that well, the two main people in the early 16th century were, we all know of Henry VIII, who was king for almost all of the first half of the century. In Spain, the king was Charles V, one of the most powerful monarchs in history. Now, the second big event that happened was Martin Luther, in 1570, nailed up 95 theses to the church door of Wittenberg, protesting about some of the Catholic practices. Now, one of the practices was, if you'd been a naughty boy or girl and sinned, you could say you were sorry, say some Hail Marys, and you could buy what was known as an indulgence. And you would pay for this indulgence, and that would get you back into the kingdom of heaven. Now, Luther thought this was wrong. I'm vastly oversimplifying, but essentially, he came up with ideas that were different from the Catholic thing, and they took hold very quickly. The word Reformation literally means reform. These religious ideas spread. Some countries went Protestant, following protesting. Some stayed Catholic. If you were a Protestant in a Catholic country or a Catholic in a Protestant country, you would be in trouble. Now, Luther's ideas spread. Even more powerful than him was John Calvin. And he set himself up down in Geneva in Switzerland. And these ideas spread and affected particularly England, we were going to talk about, and the Separatists there. And Spain, of course, was a Catholic country. Now, what happened in the Netherlands, those Protestants were persecuted by the Spanish. You'll have heard of the Spanish Inquisition. Yes. Nasty. And a lot of these Protestants fled, and Henry VIII allowed them to come across to England and settle. So from the 1530s on, there was this stream of refugees coming across to England from the Netherlands and other parts as well. So moving forward, second half of the century, Philip II, the son of Charles V, has taken over in Spain. Elizabeth has taken over from Henry VIII. Well, in fact, not directly, because Henry VIII finally had a son, Edward, who was just 9 years old when he became king, but he only lived to 15. He died. And then Henry had taken the country to be Protestant. Mary took over, and she took England back to be Catholic again. And because of the bloodshed, she's known as Bloody Mary. If you have your vodka cocktail, a Bloody Mary, that's why it's called that. Anyway, she again died only 5 years after becoming queen, and Elizabeth took over for the rest of the century. And she brought back Protestantism, and she tried to stay on a middle path. There wasn't this constant Catholic v. Protestants. And that was a factor in some of the congregations, and there were two main congregations in Nottinghamshire and just into Lincolnshire, who were the ones who formed the core of those who wanted to separate from the Church of England, hence known as Separatists. The ideas grew, and eventually they went across to Leiden in Holland for a dozen years. And then the idea grew, we'll go to the New World. And then in 1620, sure enough, the Mayflower goes off to the New World. So let's look at the Reformation. I'm going to pick up some of the main factors in England. So there's Henry VIII. 1509, he marries Catherine of Aragon. Now, there's some lovely little twists in this. Catherine of Aragon was the aunt of Charles V in Spain. I expect most of you have heard that Henry divorced Catherine because he hadn't given him a son. But 1534, he split from Rome. He took England to be Protestant again, and he divorced Catherine of Aragon. So that upset Charles V in two ways. And I mentioned these refugees coming across the Netherlands. He allowed them to settle. And then you may have heard of the dissolution of the monasteries. I know when I was young, I would go around England. I'd see just an old church with no roof and so on. But the cynics say Henry realized the Catholic Church was wealthier than him. So not only did he get rid of the Catholic religion, he went round and dissolved the monasteries and destroyed them, took their money and so on. Now, Henry did eventually have a son, Edward, who became Edward VI when he became king, but he's only 9 when he takes over. And with these refugees coming across, of course, they didn't speak English. They were French-speaking or Dutch-speaking. So in 1550, they set up the first so-called Strangers' Church in London for Dutch and French-speaking refugees with services in their own languages. And gradually, something like 20 churches were set up in the southeast of England for these refugees. Now, Edward sadly died at age 15, and Mary took over. Bloody Mary, she was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, took in to be Catholic again, and hence the bloodshed. Now, another twist. She marries Philip II of Spain, the son of Charles V. So the King of Spain, or he wasn't then king, is in England. And if she hadn't died quite soon after, the King of Spain would have continued to be the King of England as well. Twist there, because Mary does die. In 1558, Elizabeth takes over, and she's not married. She never had any children. She takes England to be Protestant again, but she tries to steer this middle way so we don't have problems between Catholic and Protestant. And there's the expression Puritan. Now, basically, the simplest way to look at Puritans is they were Protestants, but they believed in a pure and simple version. And gradually they found the Church of England version not to their liking. And the ideas grew to separate from the church. And the so-called Brownists, actually barbaric times. 3 of these Puritans were executed in London in 1593 as the thing built in momentum. So interesting, I know when I first put this, I thought, oh gosh, so there's Henry VIII. So he had 3 children who became monarchs. Edward, the son, he finally had. Mary went back to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Elizabeth was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, who again, I'm sure you've heard about. I mentioned these Puritans wishing to separate. So the Separatists, gradually the ideas grew, and come 1603, Elizabeth dies. And the irony here, again, the twist, the King of Scotland becomes King of England, because Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth didn't have any children. A sister of Henry VIII had married the King of Scotland, and hence James I inherited the throne. Now, he almost immediately banned private religious meetings, which is the reason that eventually the Separatists decided to go somewhere else. The Gunpowder Plot, I'm sure you've all heard of Guy Fawkes and so on. It was a Catholic plot to blow up the House of Parliament. This happened around this time. And again, we'll come back to Thanksgiving. I think you have written in America something called Thanksgiving. Well, we don't celebrate Thanksgiving in England. We celebrate in November. We celebrate the Gunpowder Plot. And we'll come back to the different perceptions and so on. Anyway, gradually the ideas of separate grow. The 2 congregations are called Scrooby and Gainsborough. And in 1606, they did separate from the Church of England. And then they go across to Holland. And in 1608, they went to Amsterdam. So, in fact, does the term separatist, is that universally known in America or hardly known, Richard?
Not as much. It's not a, we don't know it as well as you do.
I mean, pilgrim is probably the more usual phrase.
Pilgrim is the term. So if someone said separatists and they, saints and sinners, most people wouldn't have a clue what you were talking about. But they know pilgrim. Pilgrim is the term that stuck.
But I think the key about that is there terms on that we tend to use sort of blanket terms very often, particularly if we're in a particular country or what have you. And they're very good because they convey to most people a broad understanding. But immediately you start to get into more depth, you realize that this term saints and strangers. Now, strangers is a term we've heard used for the non-religious people on the Mayflower. I've introduced strangers' churches. When you think about it, stranger, that can be used in a number of contexts. So it's expressions and meanings and definitions are very important, but it's important to understand what's behind it. And the key with the separatists is, in this particular instance, we're talking about a group of people who wanted to separate from something else. Again, through history, you'll find that term used in other ways. But what we want to do is look at those particular separatists, the particular congregations. And here we have a map of Nottinghamshire, those of you who know England well, Lincolnshire and Yorkshire. So what's fascinating to me is it was 2 congregations in the middle of England who were the ones who would eventually go across to Holland. There were, of course, other people in other parts of England who were same beliefs, but these are the ones who happened. So some places, of course, are very key, Scrooby and Gainsborough. There's a significance to other places, Austerfield, Babworth, Sturtley. I'm not going to go into that in detail here, just give you a broad understanding. And then, of course, there were key people, Bradford, Brewster, Robinson, and Clifton. And we'll talk a bit about them. But I mentioned earlier, Puritans, they believed the Church of England had strayed from Christ and the Bible's teachings. Now, there were particular points, 4 main points. Again, I'm not going into depth, but just give you a bit of a flavor. The 4 main things: the sacraments and popery. The Puritans believed there's only 2. There's baptism and the Lord's Supper. The other's invention of man, not God. The hierarchy. We don't need a great detailed hierarchy of popes, saints, and bishops. There should be just these 5 officers with very simple titles. Predestination. They believe that God would only save the godly, those who are religious. And you can imagine discussions today, can't you, about topics like this. And then marriage in particular, that it was a civil affair, not a church affair, and it was for the procreation of children to avoid adultery. So these are the sort of things where they've got pure and simple beliefs, much when they believed that the Church of England was going too far. There are other issues that happened. The Book of Common Prayer was done in 1549. There are different versions. And again, you can visualize quite easily different people thinking we should do more of this, less of that, and so on. But that was an issue that went on and returned. Vestment, what should the people in the church wear? And again, just give you a flavor of gradually these people are thinking, look, this Church of England version of religion is not for us. We're going to leave here. And again, what's fascinating to me about America is you've got so many different religions now, haven't you? And in fact, it became a place where a lot of religious people would go across to America to get freedom from where they came from.
It is a fundamental value of this country, the separation of church and state. You are correct. Yes.
Yeah, right. So let's
so
there's a few topics there to talk about, aren't there? I mean, Dick, you react to some of those things that I mentioned.
Well, I think what's interesting, and so, for all of us, how do you make this contemporary, this conversation about these folks that were getting on that boat for religious reasons? I mean, that group, that portion of them. The man that was behind all of that really kind of spurred them on, King James. So King James, people know him because if many who go to church on a regular or irregular basis have a King James version of the Bible. So he translated the Bible into English so that people could understand it. And he had a wonderful group of scholars that did that. And many of the phrases that we use in everyday life come from the result of his scholars translating the Aramaic into to English so we could understand it. But the king also had a feeling, he read this, he thought, something, this kind of makes me special. I think I have a divine right. I must be godly. And thus he gave a speech before Parliament in 1609 in which he declared the divine rights of kings, and that anyone that would disagree with the king would be guilty of sedition, which would result in death. So we now have these passengers arriving in Plymouth, Massachusetts. I didn't know that's what it was, but Cape Cod Bay, as you talked about earlier today and in our previous conversation. And they decide, what should we do? And that took a great deal of courage because they knew that going against the king, even though they were outside of his jurisdiction, they were not in the area that would have been part of of Virginia at the time. They were beyond that. They knew that they were really treading on thin ice, that if they got into trouble, they were going against the king. And they declared some basic aspirational goals, some things they wanted. They wanted just and equal laws for people. They wanted a common government where people could work together. So this document, this compact, this bond between them was quite remarkable. Those principles became, a core portion of the thinking of the people that wrote 100 years later a document that begins with "We the People," the U.S. Constitution. So the connection between their writings, that boat, the guy that translated the Bible into English, it's all there, and it kind of makes it a little more contemporary than people might imagine. And of course, the kings didn't want people reading the Bible because prior to that, common folks who couldn't read it were just told by the priests that the government does whatever. But in the Bible, they talk about kings being overthrown, bloodshed, all sorts of stuff. So anyway, pretty interesting.
That's so interesting in a number of ways. I mean, a couple of things to throw into that. There's the monarchy has developed through to 1600. Of course, we could say all sorts of things about it in 1066 and William the Conqueror and various things
Yes.
happening. Then, of course, what happened thereafter? There were no prime ministers in those days.
Yes.
Eventually a prime minister came along. In these days, King Charles has far less power than that. He has no divine right. It's evolved. And of course, the American perspective on this, to me, what was one of the strong things in the compact was, we're not going to have kings and presidents. We're going to rule this for ourselves together and see if we can agree.
Yes.
It's not always easy.
And
But
a separation
also,
of church and state. That's very fundamental.
yeah. But another fascinating thing is, in those days, printing had only started 100 or so years before that.
Oh, yeah.
75% of the books produced then were religious books.
Yes.
Far less communication and no e-books and all the rest of it, etc. So this evolution that's happening. And what we got here is a group of people who've gone across to another land and gradually evolved, and so different religions and so on and so forth. And again, I found it amazing when I went across to America. How many are there? The Mormons, etc. There are specific, the Quakers, etc. We could go on. And when one used the term like Protestant, people say to me, "Oh, there are far more than just," and of course there were, but I deliberately talked about blanket terms because it's so important. We've got a general term that we mostly understand, but it's when you get in the detail that gets complicated.
Well, George, this has been fascinating. I always enjoy our conversation. So I look forward to the next one where we're going to learn more about all of this. Oh, but and I guess I should plug in that on that second voyage, so Alan Villiers, the great Australian captain, he did have a religious service every Sunday. So the boat headed out 2 days before Easter. I think the day before Easter, it left on a Saturday, and the next day is Easter Sunday. But every Sunday he would hold a religious on the deck of the Mayflower, and he'd read a little bit of scripture, and then he'd give a little bit of history about the voyage. And one of the things that was interesting, as I had mentioned, I think in our last conversation, is that they tried as best as possible to make the recreation of the voyage with this replica as similar to the original voyage as possible. Yet everyone on board knew that they had it vastly different. They were not in the cold North Atlantic waters. That was number one. The days were getting longer. They were in the spring going towards summer. The original voyage, the days were getting shorter every day. And they had 102 other people on board. So the second one had a crew, had 33 bold men and a cat running the ship. And, hundreds of years earlier, they had roughly an equal amount of crew, but they also had 102 people. And so it was quite different, but the spirit was the same. And it just, the second time, for the first time, people didn't know that those protesters headed off to the New World. The second time around, the whole world knew, and it was the news story of 1957. Wherever you were on Earth, you were keeping track of what was going on every day with that voyage. But we can talk about that more in another.
I mean, the contrast is fascinating. Losing my voice. Let me hand back to you. I'm going to go and get a drink.
It's quite all right. Luckily, we have the ship. He's going on board. So for all of us that are sitting here, I think he just went on board the ship to get a drink of water. But the second was quite remarkable, and it looked like that. So they did a very good job of making it look as accurate as possible with it down to. And one of the things George had asked in one of the, anyway, he's back. George, I just mentioned to the audience that as you went, because you have that virtual background, it looked as though you went on board the ship, ironically. And when you look at this later, you'll be able to, it looks like you dashed off, you got aboard the ship, you got some fresh water, which they would have had in both locations, by the way, the original one and the second one. A lot of the fresh water they got from capturing rainwater. So if it rained, they would get the water. The replica had it had a lot of water on board that it brought, but it was limited. So they only used it for for consumption and some cooking, but everything else, the water came from the heavens. And George, welcome back. I think we're probably about to wrap this up.
Yeah. Well, I think next time you one or two, I mean, it'd be great to hear more about the Mayflower II in detail. So either you could do that next time. I think the next thing I would do is, I love this term ancestors' footsteps. People coming across, particularly from America to Europe, where their ancestors lived, particularly the Mayflower collection, but going thereafter. And I've got involved in organizing tours. And I find it's just lovely when you actually organize a good tour when people are like, gosh, this is where my ancestor lived and so on. And typically, particularly coming from America, there are people who've never been to Britain before or Europe. And so you want some standard tourist stuff, like go and see the Buckingham Palace and so on. But then you want bits about, and of course, with history, we're learning a bit more about people came from. But that actually the ability to go and see places, and there's different types of places. We mentioned the Scrooby and Gainsborough, where the original Separatists came from, the original Pilgrims. Now, about a third of the passengers had ancestors who were there, but of course the so-called strangers weren't there. You can go across to Holland, to Leiden in Holland, and see where those people lived. And so you may have a direct connection because of an ancestor or just an interest.
Yes.
You can go to the places where the Mayflower touched base, Southampton, Plymouth, and so on and so forth. So those types, there are three main types of area like that. And then the places that are specifically about that person.
Yeah.
Now, there are some passengers they know nothing about where they came from. Others know a lot. You mentioned William Brewster. There's someone who quite a lot is known. So it's fascinating to be able to walk in your ancestors' footsteps, either because you've got an ancestor who was on the Mayflower or because you've got an interest and so on. And a well-planned journey is very interesting. So what do you want? Would you like to do the Mayflower II next time, or should we do ancestors?
Or we can talk about that or one of these things. George, whatever our conversations are, they're always fun, and hopefully people are enjoying listening to the two of us chatter away about events long ago that still have relevance today.
Okay, that's great. So thanks so much for watching. Please like and subscribe to us on YouTube, help the channel grow, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.
George, have a wonderful day. Thanks.